Welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us on this really warm, lovely, sunny evening. This is the first in a series of 3 talks which make up this year's London Society Architecture School. My name is Alpa Dupani. I'm an architect and a London Society trustee. I put the series together, so I very much hope that you will enjoy it. The theme for the Architecture School this year, as you will no doubt be aware, is change and the public good. So this is an exploration of moments in London's history where development for the benefit of people, not profit, has influenced and continues to inform the built environment of the city. So to kick us off with the series, tonight we have with us architect Graeme Sutherland, who is going to connect the transformational impact of underground sewers delivered in the 19th century in response to the ailing health of the city to the all-London green grid in the 21st century, which was a policy framework for green infrastructure across London for the benefit of people and wildlife. So for those of you that don't know, Graeme is co-founding director of Adams and Sutherland, an award-winning practice which brings together architectural, landscape and urban design skills, and who have worked in London mostly on public projects over the last 20 years. And some of the key published work includes the Olympic Greenway, Bow Riverside, and most recently Poplar Works. And Graeme has also taught and examined extensively in schools of architecture, is a design advisor to the GLA and sits on several London design review panels as well. So really pleased to have Graeme with us to kick off the series. Before I hand over, I will just add that the London Society Architecture School also ties in with the London Festival of Architecture, which runs throughout June. It's got a programme of really amazing events that are linked to the theme of care. And I believe Graeme is actually running an event as part of that as well. So maybe you can fill you in on that. That's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Graeme. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Alba. And thank you all for coming. I can't see you all, which is probably a good thing. So I think we've got not a lot of time. So if I start, is that clear? I hope that's clear for everybody. I'm going to talk, as Alpa said, a bit about some thoughts about infrastructure and what lies beneath our feet in London and how that has been, how that's changed over the years. So 2 networks. In the 19th century, Sir Joseph Bazalgette's sewage system, done for the Metropolitan Board of Works in the 1860s. And in the 21st century, the All-London Green Grid, a policy framework for the Greater London Authority to promote and connect green infrastructure. If the city is a body, perhaps the sewers are the veins and the arteries, a closed circulation. And perhaps the green grid is a bit of a brain. It's an open network of connections. Anyway, that's what these drawings suggested to me. I think that's useful. They're also both, neither of them are abstract systems. They're not abstract grids. They're sensitive, grounded in circumstance, and all about the particular, which I think is also really important and interesting. Zooming in, as I know some of you wanted to see more of those maps, I'm also going to then go on to talk about how we have encountered both systems, working in the Greenway in East London, and how we've overlain essentially a bit of the green grid onto what you can see of a sewage system. And this is now history. This is not current work. 150 years ago, Bazalgette. 10 years ago, what we did, what the green grid was. What's happened since? I think it's interesting to think about things with a bit of distance and perhaps to reflect on what things have become and what they meant at the time. But the beginning really of all of this, the beginning of London is the river. And it's not just one river, it's lots of rivers. The dark blue are the hidden, the secret, the underground rivers. They've been bricked over time as the city's extended, but they're still there. And we're in an alluvial valley. There's a lot of rivers meeting the River Thames. And historically, rivers are a source of drinking water. And then almost at the same time, there's sewer. And gradually that doesn't begin to work. And the tipping point, I mean, London became a pretty smelly and unsanitary place to live for many centuries. But the tipping point really happened in the 1840s and 1850s. The rapid urbanization of the centre, little attention paid to how waste was sorted, and the arrival of cholera and cholera epidemics, topical theme thinking about epidemics today. And so in the 1840s and 1850s, there were a series of cholera epidemics when thousands of people died in the city. And you could say the city was at significant threat. And it came to a head in 1858 when the Great Stink arrived, and the Thames was particularly noxious. And as is the way with these things, it impacted on, well, the change came because it impacted on Westminster. Houses of Parliament had to be closed, MPs had to be shipped out, and they were most upset. And so actually action began to be taken. The irony here is that all of the action is inspired by smell. And in the mid-19th century, there was a lot of belief in the idea of miasma and that bad smells communicated disease. Of course, we know now that cholera is spread by poor water and through the water, insanitary water conditions. So helpfully, the water was smelly. So that was dealt with. And what happened was that Joseph Bazalgette, a pioneering engineer, became the chief engineer for the Metropolitan Board of Works. And he had been agitating for a number of years to look at more strategic solutions to the sewage system, not just to make the brick in the rivers and make it all get into the Thames in a quicker way. And this is him in the right-hand corner, a rather serious-looking young man with extraordinary facial hair, which only just grew over the years. And his great idea, and it's pretty fantastic, was to connect, to introduce a series of east-west interceptor sewers, which intercepted the rivers running north-south into the river or south-north into the river, and collected the effluent and took it downriver through a series of principal smaller sewers and principal sewers to Beckton on the north side of the Thames and Crossness on the south side. And then sewage was then treated at that point. Initially, it was chucked in the river, which was a little bit stupid because of the Thames is tidal, so some of it went straight back up. But gradually over time, it was taken out and dumped in the North Sea. And actually, only recently has that stopped. So we're looking at 150 years worth of city survival. And the system, this is the key system. These are the key. There are lots of other subsidiary sewers and connectors that fed into this, but the main gist of it is the sort of the northern high, the middle level, and the northern low level, which follows the river, and then the southern outfall, which goes off through Plumstead down to Crossness. What is interesting about all things is what happens as a side effect. What's the added value or the hidden extra? And here, the obvious one in central London is the embankment. The embankment is a super sewer. It's also everything else. It reframes the London's riverside. It humanizes the north side of the river. It gives it that connection, notwithstanding the current traffic issues that London's never had with the river. It sped the river flow up, so it meant that the river became healthier and cleaner, and it was built as part of the sewage system. Down in the depths, as I said, it's a very complex and atmospheric network, which I've not seen, but I've read about in some detail. There were a number of sections. I mean, one of the things about Bazalgette was he was fastidious about detail, and there are stories of him visiting site, and this is a very senior bureaucrat being on site, ensuring the quality of what was delivered. And you can see here glazed bricks in the lower part of the sewer and unglazed bricks higher up, the glazed bricks describing where the moisture usually is, and particularly hard wearing, and the kind of complex geometries of things coming together. So the shapes of the sewers vary a lot, but the smaller bores are all variations on the pear or the teardrop that you can see in the top left. And the thinking behind that, which is really lovely, is about you make it narrow at the bottom, which speeds up the flow, which hastens the movement of the contents of a sewer out of that area and on, rather than collecting it in a longer period of time. So when there's not a lot, it moves out fast, and when there's more, it also ships out at the same rate. So there's something very beautiful about that as a kind of a detail about perhaps describes a wider intention. That was 150 years ago. it's still here, and it's still it's the reason that we are the city we are. It's the reason that London is a world city and has been so successful. You cannot underestimate how fantastic this bit of work was. But and it has been added to. There was major adding in the 20s and 30s. There's been tweaks and cranks. And then there are dealing with problems. And most people will know fatbergs, which are accumulations of fat that are in particularly narrower sewers, but are just acquiring, which is to do with what we chuck in the sewer these days. And a poor character spending his life unpicking it. But one example of what's going on. But the longevity, I think, is really powerful, as is the reinvention. And I think that's something that's characteristic of really good infrastructural networks and frameworks, whatever their content or their nature. So it's the capacity to absorb what's gone before, and then the capacity then to reinvent themselves and to evolve and to retain their usefulness. And this is the London Tideway Tunnel, and this is an enormous bit of infrastructure. It's £4.5 billion worth of infrastructure. And what this does is complete that diagram that I showed earlier of Bazalgette's sewers. Because what I didn't say was that what he didn't do, well, first of all, the sewers are combined, which meant surface water and effluent and sewage goes in together. So when it rains, they get quite busy. And when it rains very hard, they overflow. And for Bazalgette, he just let the overflow go into the Thames, which was better than it had been before. And that was the situation until very recently. We were still chucking raw sewage into the Thames when it's very, very rainy. And you don't notice it because it gets whizzed out by the tide, but it's there, and it's really not a good thing. So the Thames Tideway Tunnel is a super tunnel which more or less follows the line of the Thames and collects that overflow. So it ensures that no stormwater effluent flushes out the sewers into the river. And it continues to the east. It joins Abbey Mills pumping station, more of which later, very important moment in the network. And then a new tunnels board under the Greenway heading to the Beckton sewage, which takes it down to the sewage treatment works. So it parallels what's going on. It's at a deeper level. You can just about make out the orange high vis of the workers in the photograph. It's a huge tunnel, which describes its capacity and its need. And that's, I think, really exciting. And it's testament to the system that we have, that it can take that addition and that amendment. So if we come forward 100 years, we're in a different environmental crisis, a much more broader ranging, a much less domestic and local one. And it has many different manifestations, and this is a pretty bleak version of one of them. Ordinary everyday view of Canary Wharf on a hot day. Air quality is very poor. The inset is Putney High Street, which is one of the most polluted high streets in London. And these are not doctor photographs. I haven't been photoshopping and making it worse. If anything, there it's worse than it looks on the photographs. So that's the context for thinking about green infrastructure. And green infrastructure it's parks, it's waterways, it's paths, it's fields, it's trees, it's woods, it's gardens, it's the works, it's sports grounds, it's a multiplicity of spaces. And it's been recognized as being important forever. The idea of a green link was invented it was perhaps codified in the 19th century. But in London, it definitely jumps out of the Great London Plan, Abercrombie's great vision for London. This is the Lee Valley, being described as a multi-use, a green wedge, which has a variety of multi kinds of public uses and green infrastructural uses. And more laterally, there are footpaths and there are links, the London Loop, the Capital Ring, and the most recent, most obvious ones. And every borough had its own map of how to connect to green spaces. So there's nothing new in the idea of a green grid and its value. But what was interesting about the All London Green Grid was taking a more strategic view and thinking about a city as a whole, all its green spaces, but also valuing the variety of green spaces. So the photographs perhaps show ones you're not quite familiar with. We're not talking about Hyde Park or Hampstead Heath or the river, the downside, the river at Greenwich. These are much more interesting and residual landscapes which add to and are part of that wide network which makes up London, makes London an incredibly green city. And the Green Grid, really, the idea behind it was about connecting, making connections, and describing the layers of benefits you can get from that, and just making that very clear. And thinking about multi-use again, really thinking about that right at the beginning. So it's a place of amenity, it's a place for healthy living, it cools the urban environment, it promotes sustainable food, it enhances biodiversity, and introduces resilience. It's got many aspects to it, and that multi-headedness is really important and very strong. And then lurking in there is reducing flooding, and that's very topical, and that particularly in our times of climate change is really, and the climate emergency, that's very important. But reducing flooding before it gets into the sewer network is actually helping Bazalgette. And so the sewage, relieving pressure on the sewage network is one of the jobs of the Green Grid. And that there's a nice bit of synergy there. And that's good. But to where you start with that is, well, we go back to the geology and the geography of London. So this is rivers plus the underlying landscape of London. So London is an alluvial valley, but there are uplands of chalk, there are gravel and sandy hilltops, there are clay to the edges, and there's the floodplains near the Thames itself. And that gives rise to a very complex and really rich set of landscape conditions, which are lurking in your back garden, but are not necessarily visible, and they're not strategically visible until you sort of zoom out. And the other thing which I like about this, noticed about this drawing, is that the rivers which are not covered up are really evident here, whether it's the Roding or the Lee, the Brent or the Colne or the Wandle. They're all really strongly visible in this topography. So there's a kind of sense of the landscape under your feet. And that's not a new idea, but that's a really powerful idea, and it's important to think about it as a totality. And it's particularly important when you think about how London's politically divided. We're in boroughs. Boroughs have borough boundaries. Political boundaries are always on the edge of things, or in the middle of rivers, or the tops of hills. They have no relationship to landscape character. And so the All-Green London Green Grid looked at London as a series of characteristic landscapes, and 11 different frameworks were drawn up, what unified each of those frameworks was the underlying characteristic, and the names give it away. Arcadian Thames, so that's about the royal landscape, to the west, heading up towards Windsor. London's downlands to the south, it's chalk hills and chalk woods, and downs above London in the south. And the Wandle Valley, an industrial riverine valley which goes down from the south. The Brent Valley and Barnet Plateau, the Epping Forest, and the Finchley Ridge. It's all lurking in the names. And they're really evocative and powerful names, and they're powerful places, and they have a landscape character. So when it came to thinking about making the grid, and the Green Grid is really just a set of books with a set of drawings and a set of join the dots projects. How do you make things connect up? How do you make this network really work for animals and for people, for water? And where can you unlock those connections so that it's possible to have parallel networks of ways of inhabiting and using the city? And so each of the frameworks has got its own characteristic, its own description of its place, and slightly different priorities. So some of the outer boroughs began to look at how the green belt is used, the value of those spaces which are kind of in between green belt and city edge, the rise of city farming and the edge, where the people are still farming and encouraged to grow things coming back into the city. Water courses, and crossings, woods, and the rest. And the projects, wide range of projects, physical or to do with activity, but really about supporting that. So that was 10 years ago. And policies have a shelf life. Politics moves on. The Green Grid still exists. It's less referred to, but it's there. It was taken up by boroughs. It's referred to as an idea, and the database is used. But the idea of how London is currently described in terms of a network of green infrastructure is as a national park city. And London is the world's first national park city in 2019. And by national park, it is we mean a national park with rangers. And the map is the green stuff. That's the value of, and it shows you how much, very quickly, how much green our city is, and how much value there is, and how much there is to connect and to support and to thrive. And the byline for the national park city is greener, healthier, and wilder. So that you can't argue with that. It's good. And it has a different emphasis. So it's not policy driven. It's not top down. It's not a kind of network to be distributed. It's not just strategic vision other than the idea, which is a shift in values. It recruits people, and it invests small organizations with value and makes connections, and celebrates how you personally might influence or impact your local nature reserve, the connection to your local park, the edge of the users group that you're connected with the waterway that's near you, or how local gardens in a street might change their nature. So it could be a very small project and a very large project. It provides an umbrella. So in that sense, it's very good. On the downside, it is a kind of people version of crowdfunding, infrastructural crowdfunding, and that is participatory. It's useful. It gives it's a very good thing to initiate projects, but also it's do-it-yourself infrastructure, and there's only so much that can be done. So it's difficult. It's important not to overstate what can be achieved just by individuals with no support and no strategic thought and no investment. So that's the two systems. Our involvement in sort of overlaying one with the other happened in the Lee Valley. It happened initially across the Lee Valley where the Olympic Park was, and then extended to the length of the Greenway. And so really to talk a little bit about what we did, and some of the tactics we used to look at the connections between those two ideas. And I'm not sure we thought the Greenway that we were doing was part of the Green Grid particularly at the time, but it certainly was. And we were very alert to Bazalgette's work and the importance of that. And so this is an aerial photograph, the recent aerial photograph of the Lee Valley. You can see the Olympic Stadium in the top left, and that very clear green corridor which cuts across goes under railways, it goes across roads, it goes across over railways and rivers. That's the northern outfall sewer, which is the northern outpost of the sewage network, heading towards Beckton off screen on the right hand side. So even from the air, it's a really powerful thing. Essentially it's a raised path. It's always been a raised path. As soon as it was built, it was a raised path, and local people have used it until about 20, 30 years ago illegally, but it was still there. It was a Thames Water asset that people got on there and used it. About 20 or 30 years, well, probably longer now, 30, 40 years ago, it became the Greenway. So it became codified as a path. By the time the Olympics had alighted in the Lee Valley, it was an interesting place, a fantastic wild landscape, but also for them an opportunity to create a cycle and pedestrian access to the games, which was sustainable and also had an element of legacy. I think the most important thing about Olympic Games is legacy. And one of the key strategic things about legacy across the Lee Valley has been connectivity and making it easier to get from Tower Hamlets to Stratford and back. And a key part of that was uplifting the Greenway. The thing was, we really liked it as it was. We thought that wildness was really important. So that was a very important thing that we managed to, we were successful in retaining that character. And underneath, of course, you have Bazalgette. I think that's him on balancing on the beam in the middle left etching, looking at the construction of the two bores of the tunnel and finished in the early 1860s. And then today, in the 30s, they added another two. So it's a 4-bore tunnel. It's a raised bank. It sits above the landscape, so you get the sense of both apartness and view across what was industrial, what is now still infrastructural, in spite of the Olympic, and in terms of green infrastructure, in terms of Olympic Park, some development, and then beyond that, the city beyond. And for us, it was about the opportunity to make a new path. That was what was required. It was really about upgrading a space. So we thought of that as this is our longest building. It's 2.5 kilometers long, and it's about 200 mil deep. So there was something very nice about a very long and skinny building, and how you articulate that and how it sits on top of this fantastic bit of infrastructure, which is hidden, but fully functional. So that in itself was a constraint. I mean, having contractors doing anything above the sewage tunnels is a source of great anxiety to the Thames water. So we laid a path, we laid a datum, we populated that with landscape, which was wild. We cleared the clutter, so there was a sense of view, and we introduced objects which have various programmatic requirements. As you walk along the sewer, as you walk along the raised bank, you wonder, what is this? And then you come across mysterious alignments of sewage, of manhole covers. And one of the things we did was to frame them up and emphasize them. And as soon as you get a whiff, you're pretty clear what's going on underneath. So it's clearly something to do with sewage in the area. But by framing them up using recycled materials, we were kind of beginning to describe what's happening in the landscape, and making a connection between what you can see and what's underneath, and also interrupting what's a very long, narrow path and giving it a series of breaks. There were places to sit, places to pause, and they were done in a really robust way, which has got much more to do with the world of civil engineering than it has to do with benches and high streets. And it's important this was not a high street. This is a wild place, and it should remain so. And we also knew the Olympic Park would have its own identity, which would be parky. So it was important it was not the Olympic Park, wonderful as that is. There was a narrative around habitat, and as you saw from the section, there's a very skinny bit of ground on top of the sewers. So it's a very thin layer of ground, which is ideal for those species which like low nutrition landscapes. So we made that even more so. We made rubble beds. This is a rubble bed made from recycled roof tiles from building demolished by Olympics, which then supports a different kind of wildflower and wildlife. And so the plan, I think we successfully increased the biodiversity across the site. As with all things to do with multi-use, there's always points of interaction, shall we say. So here, what we had to resolve was the pressures of a cycle route, and people who quite rightly really enjoy this, and we're improving it, making an upgraded path and a clearer differentiation between ground and path, and the place is light, so that became a really good cycle route. But equally, the Olympic had a very commendable and far-seeing program of accessibility. And so it was important that we had a fully accessible landscape. So how do you make a fully accessible landscape sit with a cycle path in a very restricted place? And do it in such a way that it's not an essay in blister pavement and totally incomprehensible bits of surfaces. So we evolved a concrete path as a good way of efficiently making this new crust, this new building. And one path was exposed aggregate, the other path was brushed, so there's a differentiation. And there's a series of things that break it up. There's a central piece of embedded gravel. There were the cobble strips that framed events. There were nameplates that named the parts. And then there are areas of special manholes and manhole covers, which are part of Thames Water service and access requirements. And these they all get lifted and taken out. I think these are to do with damming the sewers in times of need. And so there we took the opportunity of looking at different kinds of infill. And this wonderful material, I don't know whether it's still made, but at this time it was called Traxmax, and it's a recycled aggregate. And the color comes from the fact that it's a recycled domestic China things, i.e. toilets. So the avocado sweets of the 1980s have found their way into describing the sewage network of the 1880s in the 2020s. But very beautiful. So the other thing was that it was quite a surreal landscape. There were objects around, and some of those objects were functional and they had a reading. Others less so, but there was a kind of character of that surreal and a mystery as well. So one of the requirements of the accessibility audit was that we had to have a perch, a place to rest every 50 meters. And that really helps those who are less mobile. Doesn't mean you have to have a park bench. So we introduced these concrete blocks, these perches, which clearly are working, those younger candidates there, but for various people, they work. And we took the opportunity to think about, well, can we have some fun? So they're all numbered. And the numbering, those of you who know, AOD stands for altitude over datum. And rather than it become a milestone or a 20 meters to this or 500 meters to that, every perch has got its own essentially height above sea level. And if you walk along the Greenway and you keep your eyes peeled, you'll notice that they descend. Of course they do, because the Greenway sewer is laid to fall. The sewage is pumped out of the ground by the pumping station at Abbey Mills, and then it falls 8 kilometres, 7 or 8 kilometres east to the Beckton to the sewage works. So it's a very nice way of just describing a very subtle thing that's happening in the landscape that you wouldn't allow. The fall is very subtle indeed, but do the math, it's there. There was the whole thing about identity, which I won't dwell on, but it was to do with character and vertical elements in a flat landscape, and generous and robust signage, which has got a different character again. And so that was what we did on the Olympic section of the Greenway. But that was really only about access and physical improvement and our enjoyable narratives. There's more to green spaces than that, and there's more to the Greenway as well. The bit we've looked at is just this bit. So the first 2.5 kilometres. There's another 8 kilometres in total from the pumping station here, where the 3 levels come together, down to Beckton sewage works in the east. And as part of Legacy, Thames Water, who were the owning asset owner, the Olympic Delivery Authority, who were funding it, and GLA, who were the key stakeholder, came together to think, can we look at a project that brings benefits to the whole Greenway, not just the bit that touches the Olympic Park. And as you go east, it changes. It becomes less of a bank. It's a bank in places. It becomes more domestic, back gardens back onto it. We lose some of the wildness, but it's still a pretty extraordinary space. And it's a very well-used path. But it's a path. So what do you do with a path? It's not that wide. So thinking about infrastructure, a really good example of infrastructure with other meanings is the Lee Valley Reservoirs. This is the King George Sailing Club, the biggest sailing club in London. This was not built as a lake for sailing. This was built as London's water supply, but it's now also a place of amenity. So could the Greenway be a very skinny reservoir and do a lot of other things and just be a path? And as a way of doing that, we worked up a strategy, and that strategy had to do with making a coherence. So some of the stuff we've done already, bringing it along and uplifting its visual appearance, but that's probably the least important thing. We identified a number of places, adjacencies, mostly adjacencies off the Greenway, which could support other activities, whether it be play, whether it be growing, whether it be a whole access. It could be a raft of different kinds of ways of new connections to green infrastructure. So spaces that would extend the space of the Greenway, and they tend to be in the ownership of the council. The Greenway is in the ownership of Thames Water. So in working with the Newham Council was very important as well. And then on top of that is this idea of activity. So what do people do there? What can you do and how can you program it? So from introducing things like tours and the Greenway Run to a whole range of ideas. And then tied in together, how does it work? Who looks after it? Who gets involved in it? So a bit like the Green Grid, that became a mini document, full of a lot of ideas. It went out there. And it was, at the time, we were about, and then we started looking at some of the connections we made, and one in particular, which we sort of knocked on doors and this is Newham General Hospital, as was Newham University Hospital. It backs immediately onto Greenway. Its grounds are an appalling mix of car park and leftover space. There's been no attention paid to any kind of amenity, external amenity, apart from the odd courtyard garden. And that's not going to change. So that's something that could really be looked at. And we thought, well, the Greenway billows out at this point. It's wider. It's got an immediate adjacency. The hospital has organised their own single corridor. If you made connections to the Greenway, which is more or less at grade access here and here, you could introduce a whole circular route. You could have new gardens. You could make a kind of therapeutic walk that was part of the hospital treatment. So this was all kind of exploratory, shall we say. So we went to speak to the hospital, and they were really happy, and they were really interested, and they were particularly interested in the idea of an orchard. And we talked to the hospital administrators, and we worked up a scheme for an orchard, which would be a community resource. It would be quite significant scale, and the produce of that orchard would feed into the canteen in the hospital, and there'd be a sort of literal symbiosis. And that was all ready to go. And then, it being 10 years ago, we had austerity, and we had a change in government, and we had a complete change in politics. And the document died. The hospital at the same time became a different trust. So everybody we talked to disappeared. And the conjoined trust with two other hospitals had a different agenda. So this sort of fine grain, speculative, improving their adjacency for multiple use, but very difficult to pin down, was not on their agenda. And that's where it was left. And so what happened next? So actually what happened next is that maybe what we do is we're gardeners. The seeds grew. Some of the work that was in that book, it was taken up by Newham, and they have made improvements to entrances. They've taken some of the Greenway identity a bit further along, and they've done some things. But actually, what's much more interesting is that Greenway Orchard Gym, the Greenway Orchard Green Gym, has appeared next to the hospital, and there is an orchard there, and there's a really vibrant small community group, very keen. And this was 2020, and they're just about to reawaken after the pandemic. There are trees, there's crop, there's produce, and it's really satisfying. And they recently raised enough money to get themselves a shed. So there's a sense that things do happen over time, and I think that's pretty heartening. So really, to end with a few slides on the idea of connection. As architects know that connecting points of connection are the points where you can enjoy. So the junctions in that amazing interior are case in point. That's a place of celebration and a place to think about perhaps the wider stuff which is doing its job and to add a layer of delight. So this is Abbey Mills pumping station, and this is a point of connection in the sewage network. This is where the sewer is brought up and then sent along the Greenway. And this is the interior, which is just a fantastic riot of Italianate and it's just a mixture of everything, Gothic revival and what's very nice is that this slide was 2 years ago. When I was last there, it was all, and you can see in the background, a kind of institutional, rather lime green. It's still pretty fantastic, but there's no sense that this polychromatic wonderfulness was lurking. The building was good. One of the things we did as part of the Greenway structure, I mean, it may not sound very much, but that fence there, we are responsible for that fence being here and not here. And that just feels like that's a really important triumph to have made. You can see this from the Greenway. But the interior is fantastic, and it's been loved and restored. And there was a doctoral thesis done on what color, what was it really? And in fact, it was a stonking set of bunkerish colors. So thinking about connections, and maybe connections in the green grid, this is just to finish on another project we did very locally down the River Lee, about half a kilometre down from where the Greenway starts. This is the Bow Roundabout. This slide I was talking about this earlier with Alpa. This was taken a while ago. There has been some development in inverted commas here, but it's still the same. And the Bow Roundabout, when we came to it, was a severance. And it was a severance, if you remember back to Abercrombie's plan of the River Lee walkway, 23 miles of leisure connection from Ware and Hertford down to the River Thames, blocked by the 1960s Bow Roundabout, which meant, and this is before the work was done, you had to get out and cross the road and go down. But crossing the road meant crossing a 6-lane dual carriageway going in 4 different directions. So it was not easy. There was no crossing. So that's a clear blockage in the system. And in retrospect, it's a clear green grid block. And so our commission, which took many years to kind of evolve, but it did happen at the same time as the Greenway about 10 years ago, was to make a connection under the bridge through what looks like a dark and unforgiving space, but actually when you're in it, it's rather wonderful undercroft. And what we produced was we produced a bridge, but also a walkway and an underpass. We produced habitats. We produced access to new wood just to the left there. And what was really important was that we didn't invest all that energy in making some sort of structural statement about crossing. We thought about a sequence of spaces, all of which were as important as the other, one of which happened to be a crossing, and that's it there. And if you go back, I think I can probably go back to here. You can see this zigzaggy nature of the whole thing. And that's partly to do with the functional requirements of getting to a certain height here and then getting down to get clearance under here and making that ramp work in an incline which didn't require which is comfortable at 1 in 21. It's partly to do with narrowing the waterway and catching areas for habitat to grow. It's partly to do with connecting into this amazing bit of woodland, which was caught between the river and the motorway, and which we turned into a woodland walk, totally unexpected and rather and a great offset. And the spaces underneath and around, the character of it's driven by the nature of existing sheep piles and new buffers to stop boats demolishing our piles. A filigree of vertical fingers of timber, which, unlike handrails that close down, it opens up to the sky, so it's not about closing you off. And you can see a secondary structure hiding in there, which is the beams which hold it all up. That very nice sense of layering. And also cranking it meant that cyclists couldn't go quite so fast, and there was some chance of coexistence. And then as you go under, the space is just fantastic, and this has light, but even when there was no light, it's really about just removing the darkness and light, the shadow that you get, the contrast from inside to outside. But one of the things that we did here was, we working with an artist, we introduced some light which was hidden in the balustrades into the edge of our walkway here, which shone across the water, and then was angled such that any movement in the water then sparkled on the far wall. So there's a sense of movement. So when you're actually in this space, there's always, you always feel you're with someone, even though it may be empty, because there's a sense of movement and activity. And the canal, although still, has always got movement. And then even simple things like the strategic point of making the walkway sure it was in the outside curve, so you can see where you're going, not on the inside curve, so you can't see where you're going. And then to end with a nighttime view, which shows some of that character, and really about infrastructure as connection. And so we didn't think about it at the time when this was conceived. The green grid didn't exist in the form it did. It became, now it's gone, but this is clearly a linking point. And so thinking about, so what are the equivalents of Bazalgette's pumping stations? So this is one of them. And there are many, many opportunities across London to do things. And they can be modest. They can be a new gate. They can be extraordinary. They can be ways across waterways or ways across busy roads and green bridges and green links, or they can be sort of bits of infrastructure like this. But I think that's me finished at 7:15 exactly. So that's good. I must have forgotten lots of things to say. Thank you.
Impeccably timed. Thank you, Graeme. I thought that was fascinating. I hope you all enjoyed that. I really enjoyed how you brought the strands together of the historic sewer and the green grid, and you know, from the detail of Bazalgette's original sewers and that cross-section that you showed us, to you know, the idea of valuing London's multitude of green spaces, including its wilder spaces, which you've done a lot of work to celebrate, and ending on that those atmospheric photos of the bridge, just wonderful. Thank you. So we do already have a couple of questions, and a couple of really good ones. So Julia, hi Julia, has a question about the tideway. I don't know, can you see the questions as well, Graeme?
I've just, oh yeah, Julia, hi Julia. I've just called them up, yeah.
So there's a great question about the tideway and also about the lost rivers. So perhaps you'd like to just tackle those.
Right. Right, yes. Sustainable drainage and the tideway. Yeah, sustainable light touch versus big time infrastructural investment. You need both. I think sustainable drainage is really important, but it's taking a while to take hold of, and it's the only way forward. But not everywhere, not every site in London will be able to deal with its own surface rainwater and hold it. I mean, it's beginning to be the case, and we're certainly working projects that's the biggest priority. But not all sites are as big as is possible. But the tideway is not just about, and it's still about sewage and effluent and how that's dealt with. And it's still about taking the pressure off a bit of 19th century infrastructure, which is past its sell-by date, and will be continuing on for another 100 years, irrespective of that. And so that's good. I think, but the opposition to tideway, well, it's done. It's one of these projects. It's a tanker of a project that started 20 years ago. It started on site 8 years ago. It's due to finish in 3 years. So I think it's it's what's important is to make sure the next wave of infrastructure doesn't require that investment. And then we use what we have got in the best possible way. I don't know eminent Thames Water anymore in terms of access to sewers. They do like it. Open house is a good time. I did have lots of good contacts, but they've all retired. You can get down to the sewers, but you have to persevere. But the pride that's been taken in Abbey Mills is very evident, and I'm sure that is definitely open in during open house and other things.
Yeah, that has been open a few times. I know it was closed while some work was going on, but I'm sure that that will be open for visitors.
Well, the tideway comes under it, so it uses that area. So that's interesting.
And
I'm answering questions that you should read them out first.
No, I mean, please go ahead.
Oh, but people need to hear what they are. They can't see them.
Yes, of course. So Adam had a question about London's lost rivers.
Yeah.
And, with a lot of them being under buildings and roads and opportunities to expose them. I mean, has that been part of your work or your research at all?
I know a little bit about it. It's on everyone's agenda. It's not a new idea. It's a really good idea, and it should happen wherever possible. A good place to see it is Lord Shipwreck in Haringey, where the Moselle has been liberated. Although that was probably a channel before. Now it's made into a proper river. There are moments across London where it's happening, not enough, and it certainly could happen more. And that'd be great. I completely agree.
Great. Well, there was a comment from Simone saying fantastic talk, and that she lives beside the Greenway and had assumed it was railway infrastructure, but mentioned about crime being a challenge. And I just wondered, just because also you mentioned about graffiti earlier, is that something that you might want to talk about?
Well, I think crime is a big issue. I mean, it was quite different in different parts of the Greenway, and one of the problems with the Olympic stretch was that no one lived there. And there was a sense that you were sending yourself into a dark place that was dangerous. In fact, it wasn't that dangerous. The edges were dangerous, but the middle wasn't at all. But where you go further east and you have that proximity, then it really definitely is an issue. It's a good place for scooters to escape along. There's lots of connections with roads, and you're right, there is no postcode, so you can't. Well, there must be a way of resolving that. I think that's a bit. If there must be a way of giving it a name and a place so you can report crime, and I think that could be the subject of a campaign, definitely.
So
and then I was saying to Alp earlier, I didn't do any photographs of what it's like now, partly because it's been 10 years, and anything in the public realm after 10 years has a patina, and in some places that patina is pretty graffiti orientated. Not that that's a bad thing. It makes it less clear to say what I was talking about, I think. But what the elements we talk about are all there, and they're all doing what they said they didn't intend. And what was really interesting was that the bridge particularly, it was 5 or 6 years before any graffiti at all happened there. So I thought that was really interesting. Any rule of anything you do which is fully public after 5 years, it's something else. So
it takes on its own. Yeah. Well, we have a very complimentary message from Frosso. And then Joanna has said, were you involved with the Thames Tunnel? You should have been. Did your work?
No.
Not
specifically at all, no.
And then there was a question about the LFA event, which I mentioned in the introduction. So that's related to one of your other projects, right?
Yes. As a practice, we completed some workspaces in refurb, a very different narrative, but in similar ground, very close by in Poplar, near the Ribble. It's called Poplar Works. It's a new hub for sustainable fashion in the fashion industry, it brings together teaching spaces, workspaces, and technical resources, and it's a combination of 3 different clients. Poplar Harcourt are the main clients. London College of Fashion have spaces there. Students move into studios after they've been in studying, and then there's a series of independent making spaces, both for fashion and for other things as well. And what's interesting about it from our point of view, it's all in some garages, which were a crime spot, very, very dodgy area, very unsavory, and garages that were very underused as well. And we were able to keep a lot of the garages, although you wouldn't necessarily know it when you see the building. And so for us, it's a really interesting repurposed building, and it's how you use the the basis of garage foundations and retaining walls to then build on a new structure. So, but
And that's a visit of the.
That's part of the Aberfeldy walk around, which is happening in 2 weeks, Saturday, 19th, I think.
That sounds great. Well, and I will also just squeeze in a little plug for the fact that this is obviously the first of a series of talks as part of London Society Architecture School. And we have a second talk next Thursday, which is Designs on Democracy with Neil Chassor, and one the following Thursday, which I think is the 17th, about forms of practice as well. But we do have time for a few more questions. So there's a question from...
You've got any questions, Alpha?
Have I got any questions?
Yeah, you must have some questions. Alpha Moore first.
Well, I wonder if I'll just read a few more out briefly. But I thought the question about SUDS was quite interesting, and if you had anything to add to that. And I did also want to touch on Barbara's comment. And well, Barbara said, is there a need to kickstart things coming out of the pandemic in respect to the Green Corridor? But I was just wondering if, sort of post-pandemic planning has led to a kind of renewed look at the green grid work, if there's been any sort of
I think it will lead to a renewed value in green spaces, and therefore that covers everything. I would hope it will lead to more interest in the national park city, and that seems to me a really interesting and very engaging and accessible way of participating and changing. But I think with SUDS, I mean, for those of you who don't know about SUDS, sustainable urban drainage, it's really about how do you keep surface water out of the drainage system, the sewage system, or the underground hard system as long as possible. So do you hold water in blue roofs on top of buildings? Do you hold it in rain gardens by the road or in gardens? Do you have shaped landscapes that can hold water when you get the 1 in 100 flood events that happen every fortnight now? And that holds the water, so you temporarily get ponds and puddles and small lakes. And can you introduce weave-in ponds, which also have to do with wildlife and biodiversity? And all of that narrative together can look to hold water out of the system as long as possible. London has a bit of a problem. We're on a lot of the soil is clay, so infiltration, so letting the water going into the ground doesn't necessarily work that well. Some places it's fine, but some places there's nowhere for it to go. So there does need to be a stronger strategy. But buried in the GLA website is a very good primer about SUDS. So that's a good way of beating up people.
It's a good primer.
Very, very good. So that gives you all you need to know, and that gives you a fluency to talk to people who have decisions to make.
I mean, I did have a question about the orchard, actually, and what you said about sort of things do happen over time, and this, you planted the seeds of something that could happen there, and it did evolve into that. And I just wondered, actually, is that one example of a few different strands that came out of the green grid work, and if there are other things like that you're hoping are sort of going to come?
Well, I mean, our involvement in the green grid was one tiny part. The green grid is literally an extraordinary network across the whole of London of interconnecting interstices. So, I mean, I focused on one bit that we knew a little bit about. I mean, we wrote one of the frameworks in the other side of London, but still a very small involvement. I think it was a really happy discovery. I didn't know about them. I thought something was happening, but I haven't been down there for a while. And I was only researching the lecture, I found that they exist, and actually they're a very vibrant group. But you can't, all seeds don't always grow. So I don't think you can, I wouldn't be too optimistic. It needs to be.
But are there any other little seeds that you sort of think are germinating?
Well, I think there are lots of people understand the value of open space. I mean, the thing I didn't show, I could have ended on a gate at the end of the Greenway, which is the Greenway just stops in a gate, a 6 foot high a hostile fence, and you've got to go off onto motorway. And that gate leads you to Beckton Sewage Works. And we were involved in a scheme to make the sewage work accessible around the edges and to complete that walk and get you directly to the river. And that obviously hasn't happened. And it's got challenges, so I can see why it hasn't happened. It's not easy. But some things are easy, and they are to do with just joined up thinking. And one of the things which is really important about the GLA is that it has that capacity to think of London as a whole, and then thus to think about things kind of specifically and in terms of what's important rather than political boundaries. And I think that's a really valuable benefit of the GLA, which has only been with us for 20 years. And it's not assure a future either. There's a current political impasse approaching, and so politics change, organisations change, names change. The Metropolitan Board of Works becomes something else, becomes the LCC, becomes the GLA, becomes the DLC. So it's about what you remember and what you catch. And the value of a framework is it's still around. You can dig them up. They're all online. You can read them and you go, why haven't they done that yet? That was a good idea. Yeah.
The good ideas don't die, that's what you hope. But I think that's an interesting point, especially about political boundaries, and just bearing in mind also with the Olympics and with the LLDC, the London Legacy Development Corporation, with that being a sort of agglomeration of the local boroughs, and that perhaps they were able to do more rather than if they were just the individual boroughs.
I mean, that's a good example, and that's coming to an end now. That should be
as in sort of wind up mode,
winding down. So things do change. But what's interesting about good infrastructure is that it's there already. It works with what's there, and it's strong stuff is good enough to be then be built on, and it's aggregative, not closed. It's an open system, and that's really important philosophically and in design terms. And I think that's what these two very different systems share, and that perhaps they don't immediately look like they're the same at all. But I think there's a lot more connections than you might immediately think.
There's been a message that's very appreciative of your cat in the background, but from Julia. But I was just also wondering as well, sort of more of a personal question, your interest in Bazalgette and whether that sort of predated the work that you were doing on, if that was something that you already had in your mind as something that you wanted to explore, or if the two came together at the same moment.
We've been fortunate. It's kind of slightly gone off the boil. We've been fortunate. We were fortunate to have a long period of time where we worked in one area, and we worked for different people. We worked for the different councils. We worked for a particularly important community group called Community Links, whose founders recently just died. We worked for the ODA. We worked for the LLDC. We worked for Thames Water. It's separate commissions for doing things. And what was good about that is that we began to become, as happens with many architects who work in one place for more than a fortnight, you tend to know more than anybody else because you've been around long enough. Because people change. It's not just names that change; people change. And so that longevity is important, and that's an important thing to value. And so lots of people have that in there. So I did a talk for the LFA a couple of years ago about the Royal Docks, where we also had a long involvement at one point. And it was important. It was interesting about tying together those threads of what's been done and what hasn't been done, and what was important and what's shifted. So.
Well, that's great.
Well, works good as well. That's different.
Well, I found that really fascinating. I really hope all of you out there did as well, including your questions, and thank you for your answers as well, Graeme. So as I say, we have got 2 more talks as part of the architecture school. And beyond that, I just want to say thank you to everybody, and also good night, and please do take care of yourselves. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.